The first session will be moderated by Dr. Nitin Gaikwad, sir, who is medical graduate from the JNC Nagpur. He has completed MD in pharmacology as well as FEMR from KEM Mumbai. He is having more than 25 publications in national and international journals, and currently he is professor of pharmacology and registrar at AIIMS Raipur. The second session will be moderated by Dr. Amol sir, who is associate professor pharmacology at Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research, Chandigarh. Sir has completed MBBS from KEM Mumbai and MD from Lokmanya Tilak Municipal Medical College, Mumbai. Sir is awarded with KVPY Fellowship in Internal Medicine and received Early Career Research Award by Department of Science and Technology by Government of India in 2016. He is having more than 45 publications. Now I request Dr. Nitin Gaikwad sir to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Nitya Gokte, madam. Over to Nitin.
Thank you, sir. So, very good afternoon to everyone. Respected Dr. Padmaja ma'am, Dr. Dikshit sir, Dr. Badayal sir, Dr. Kamal sir, and all the dear delegates who have joined for all this GCP program. At the outset, I congratulate the National Association of Pharmacology and Therapeutics for organizing this online workshop on good clinical practices, and also extend thanks for this invitation. I feel honored, and it's a great privilege to introduce the first speaker of today's session, my teacher at par excellence and a very good researcher from my alma mater, Dr. Nitya Gupte ma'am, Professor and Head, Department of Clinical Pharmacology, SET GS Medical College and KEM Hospital, Mumbai. She worked as editor of Journal of Postgraduate Medicine from 2012 to 2016 and also as a member of working group for ICMR Guidelines 2017. Currently, she is chairman of two institutional ethics committee, namely Tata Memorial Hospital and PD Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. She is also a member of Human Infection Challenge Vaccine Network, UK from August 2019 onwards. It's delightful to share that there is one patent with her name on protein marker for Plasmodium vivax malaria. I welcome you, madam, for this GCP workshop.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Gaikwad. Sincere thanks to the organizers as well. Dr. Gaikwad, would you stop sharing? I'll just share my screen.
And we all know that how much this documentation is important as far as ethics committee is concerned. It's an integral part. And in today's session, madam will be delivering her talk on clinical trial protocol, IB and essential documents. So ma'am, I kindly request you to take the center stage and deliver the talk. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everybody. And at the outset, my sincere thanks to the organizers, especially Dr. Ganesh, for having invited me here to speak to you. I'd also like to place on record my sincere thanks to all my teachers who have guided me over the last 25-30 years that I have been in research. Shirsagar Madam, Thatte Madam, Baudikar Sir, Dr. Reddy, and acknowledge my student, Dr. Vijaya, who helped me with some of the slide presentations. So what I will be talking to you today is about essential documents, protocol, and the investigator brochure. And all these documents are necessary before the trial, during the trial, and after the trial. This is going to be the outline of my presentation. I'll start by doing a quick recap of ICH GCP. I will define essential documents and then classify essential documents. Subsequently, I'll go on to the protocol and finally end with the investigator brochure. Since talks of this nature, especially GCP, can be particularly boring because you end up reading a lot of information that's given in guidelines, what I will try and do is to intersperse it with some of my own experiences and maybe tell you some of the mistakes that I have made personally. The important thing I think about GCP is because GCP started in the 1990s and mid 1990s, and I grew up as GCP grew. We all make mistakes in our lives, and what's important is to make new ones and not repeat the old ones. I am here today because I've made a lot of mistakes, including in clinical research and GCP. So let me start by quickly recapping ICH GCP. You've had a lecture on this last week. Essentially, ICH stands for the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human.
You can have your video on.
What I'll do now, I'll switch it on later when I finish my presentation. Yeah, I think I'm a little worried about the bandwidth here. I'm not in my office here. So this is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, and it brings together regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical industry to discuss scientific and technical aspects. So inception was in 1990. It came together as a document in the mid 1996-97, and it was established as a not-for-profit organization under the Swiss law in October 2015. Now, what is the mission of the International Council of Harmonization? Is ideally to have safe, effective, high quality medicines, and these are developed and registered in the most resource efficient manner. So what do you mean by resource efficient? The study which is done in a developed country is as good as a study which is done in a developing country or a least developed country. So you have harmonization across the world, across the board, so that we have protection of public health in the interest of patients, and everything is from the point of view of an international perspective. So the idea is to bring medications to the market very quickly. And what I would like to say is, this is slide number 6. What is GCP all about? See, at the end of your 4 weeks of this GCP workshop and at the end of my presentation today, even if you forget everything that I have said in the presentation, it doesn't matter. But never ever forget what GCP is all about, right? What is GCP all about? There are 2 tenets. GCP essentially, when we follow it, tells you that the rights, the safety, and the well-being of participants in clinical research are protected, and it ensures that there is data integrity. You may forget everything else, but if you focus on the rights, the safety, and the well-being of research participants and make sure that there is data integrity, then you would have done a good study. Now, regardless of whether the study is a clinical research study run by a pharma company or whether it is an academic study. And I'd like to state here that doing an academic study in the right way, following GCP exactly in an academic study, is as important as following GCP in a pharma funded study. Let's now go to the next part of the presentation, which is the actual topic, which is essential documents. I will start by defining essential documents and then go on to the classification of the essential documents. But before we do that, remember that the ICH guidelines are classified into safety guidelines, efficacy guidelines, multidisciplinary guidelines, and quality guidelines. There are a total of 11 safety guidelines, a total of 14 quality guidelines, a total of 14 multidisciplinary guidelines, and a total of 20 efficacy guidelines. So good clinical practice is an efficacy guideline, and it is the E6 guideline. That is the 6th efficacy guideline. So everything that I'm going to be telling you comes from the E6 or the 6th efficacy guideline. When the E6 was initially envisaged, it came as a well-rounded document, but there were a lot of changes which occurred in the world as we moved along and learned with GCP. Therefore, this document was amended in 2016 with an integrated addendum to encourage implementation of improved and more efficient approaches. So your trial design, conduct, recording, reporting, oversight, all of it need to be more improved and more efficient, leading to the E6 having an addendum. And what I'm going to talk about, that is essential documents and electronic records, have also been updated in the addendum. Therefore, What I'm talking about essential documents is not just ICH E6, it is the addendum, which is R2. Now, defining the essential documents. These are documents which individually and collectively permit the evaluation of the conduct of a trial, and it also tells you about the quality of data. So as you can see from this definition, when you conduct a trial, well, what are you doing? You're protecting the rights, the safety, and well-being of participants in research. And when you talk about quality of data, high quality data, it is automatically data integrity. Therefore, again, I'm coming back to the fundamental definition of GCP, that the rights, safety, and well-being are protected of participants, and the quality of data, the integrity of data is assured from a public perspective. So these are documents, individual documents, and together they permit the evaluation of the entire study in totality. What purpose do essential documents in GCP serve? They serve to demonstrate the compliance. The compliance of who? Compliance of the multiple stakeholders, the investigator, the sponsor, and the monitor with the standards of good clinical practice. Second, they assist in good study management by the investigator and his team, the sponsor and the team, and the monitor. And most important, you are subject today in clinical research to audits and inspections. The difference between an audit and an inspection is that the inspection is carried out by the regulator. So if you don't have these documents in place, you will fail these audits and inspections. So therefore, they help to confirm the validity of the trial conduct and again, the integrity of the data. What I would like you to remember about essential documents is these are minimum required documents. These are not the maximum required documents. It is like the Medical Council of India or the NMC laying down minimum criteria. Remember that you could have many more documents, but what this ICH tells you is what are the minimum required documents that every study needs to have. And remember that each study is different, and therefore every study can have differential document requirements. We classify them as documents before the study, during the study, and after the study. Let's begin by talking about documents necessary before the study, right? And remember, if you look at this ICH GCP, it comes in point number 8, 8.2. Each document is divided into three: the title of the document, the purpose of the document, and the location of the document. Where is it? The location is further divided into investigator location and sponsor location, specifically if the sponsor comes from the pharmaceutical industry. So what are the documents which are necessary before you start the study? Obviously, the signed protocol, any amendments, information for the participant, that is informed consent form, advertisements, financial aspects, insurance, ethics committee approvals, regulatory approvals, curriculum vitae, GCP certifications. If you're using a laboratory, then lab details and any master randomization list. During the study, you must have the IRB approval. If you've made an amendment, then the IRB needs to approve the amendment. If you have newly appointed staff after you start the study, you need to have their CVs and their IRB approvals. Any procedural updates. IP stands for investigational product, storage, maintenance, temperature logs, source documents on which something you write for the first time, signed informed consent forms, signed lab investigations, enrollment logs, sample storage logs, and so forth. After the study, the investigational product should be destroyed. You should have destruction certificates, return letters to the sponsor, a completed participant identification list, any audit letters, inspection letters, findings. Did you close out the audit? Close out monitoring from the sponsor. Treatment allocation. Did you break the blind? Did you break the blind midway? Was there a safety concern? All documentation regarding adverse events, serious adverse events, informing the regulator, informing the IRB, and finally closing it out. Once again, may I reiterate that these are minimum required documents and every study will have differential requirements. We next go to the second part of the presentation today, and that is on the protocol. What is the protocol? A protocol is essentially a blueprint. Why do you want to do the study? Where do you want to do the study? How will you do the study? What will you find? And who will do the study? If you look at the ICH definition of the protocol, it is a document that describes the objectives, study design, methodology, statistical consideration, and organization of a trial. The protocol also gives the background, why, but these could be provided in other protocol referenced documents. So what the protocol does essentially is that when you write a protocol, it helps you to organize your thoughts, right? It makes sure that you have not overlooked any critical components of the project. You also specify responsibilities, who does what. You provide detailed instruction to your site team, who is going to do what are the various techniques to be followed, what is the kind of data that will be collected, how are you going to analyze the data. And if you have a multi-centric study, for example, you end up standardizing study procedures. For example, how will you do RT-PCR, which is the kit you will use. So you standardize study procedures across the multiple sites. Again, why do we write the protocol? We make sure that you answer the research question that you've thought of, and your protocol allows you to answer this question. The study in itself is capable of giving answer to these questions, but at minimum risk to the participant. You also allow an external body, again, audits and inspections. And when a protocol is there, it ensures, again, that the two basic tenets of GCP, that is the right safety well-being, are protected, and the data is reported and the results are credible. Remember that the protocol is a team effort, right? So in pharma-funded studies, you will have the protocol being developed by the team, the investigators, their inputs, the statisticians' inputs, regulatory inputs, for example, from the subject expert committee, and you may have a pharmacist giving input. So all of these people put together will give you a good protocol. The general format of the protocol is a title page, contents, references, and appendices. The title page is important in terms of, and this is something that I see when academic studies are being developed, always ensure that you have a version and a date of the version. So if you make amendments, if you keep changing the protocol as you go along, then the version dates play a critical role. Have the name and address of the sponsor, the principal investigator, collaborator, the study site, the clinical laboratories, and any amendments and their dates. You need to have confidentiality agreements, a synopsis, which is easy. It's also usually good to have a synopsis for the lay person reading the protocol, and a synopsis for the ethics committee, the table of contents, and any abbreviations that you may use. The general contents of any protocol would be the rationale, the why, the background, study objective, study design. You could have primary, secondary objectives. You could have the study design, case control, cohort, retrospective, prospective, multicentric. Methodology, what are you going to do? How are you going to record the data? How are you going to analyze the data? And finally, the ethical aspects of the protocol. Oftentimes, I like to put the ethics under the method section, but making sure that you have IRB approval, and where applicable, clinical trial registration becomes very, very important. You need to register your protocol before you enroll the first patient in a clinical trials registry, such as the CTRI in India. I'd just like to tell you now a little bit about my experience with protocol development. This was a study which we did several years back for Ciba-Geigy. Ciba-Geigy is now Novartis. And this was the protocol of an artemisinin derivative, which we compared with chloroquine. This was a patient I saw, WMR, a 40-year-old man with uncomplicated Plasmodium falciparum malaria. He had an asexual parasite count of 36,000 parasites per microliter. I remember taking written informed consent, and the patient started getting better. It was a double-blind study, so I had no idea whether he was receiving the artemisinin derivative or whether he was receiving chloroquine. On day 5, while he was recovering, the patient was mildly febrile, but the parasite count was still there at 808 parasites per microliter. On day 6, the patient died of adult acute respiratory distress syndrome. So in this particular protocol, and remember that I'm talking about the mid-90s, this is not a protocol that you will see today, the rescue medication was not very clearly specified. When we broke the blind, we found that the patient had actually received chloroquine, and we should have actually given him rescue medication on day 3. So the point here is the investigator participating in pharmaceutical industry funded protocols, especially with regard to subject safety, becomes paramount. These are the 10 P's of the protocol. If you'd like to remember them: the place, where are you going to do it? Person, people responsible. Pre-knowledge, pre-information. The why of the protocol, the purpose. The population that you will be studying. What is your plan? Processes and procedures. Parameters that you will be estimating. Statistical analysis, so p-value. And finally, P is preparation for publication. And I'd like to end my talk, if I have a few more minutes, with the investigator brochure. So the investigator brochure is nothing but a compilation of clinical and non-clinical information related to the product that you're testing, which is called as the IP, or the investigational product. Now, why is an investigator brochure necessary? It provides investigators and others involved in the trial with information to facilitate understanding why, the rationale of the study. And with regards to the investigational product, it tells you information like what is the dose, what is the dosing frequency, method of administration, and safety procedures. It also provides insight to support the management of study participants. And remember that it is a mandatory document for ethics committee as well as regulatory submission. What I'm going to talk about, the IB or the investigator brochure, essentially comes from ICH E6 as well as the New Drugs and Clinical Trials Rules 2019. Essentially, it is the sponsor, particularly for pharma industry funded studies, who is responsible for not just providing you with an IB. Remember that the investigator brochure is a dynamic document. So you need to update the investigator brochure regularly. As an investigator, you need to be updated with the IB and submit the updated IB to the ethics committee, right? Who should prepare the investigator brochure? Again, this is a multi-stakeholder responsibility, but a medically qualified person should generally participate in creating and editing an investigator brochure, but there should be ownership of the various aspects of the investigator brochure and make sure that the disciplines that have contributed to the IB actually are part of it. So as per the New Drugs and Clinical Trials rule, I'll just end in a couple of minutes. You have a table of contents and a summary. A brief introductory statement, which gives you the chemical name, the generic name, and the trade name, where approved, the physico-chemical and pharmaceutical properties and formulation and instructions for storage. For example, you may have a vaccine which is stored as -80°C, or you may have a vaccine like Covishield, which is stored at 2 to 8°C. All this information comes in the brochure. Non-clinical aspects: how did you do the animal testing, animal toxicology, animal pharmacokinetics, and important information about reproductive toxicity and mutagenicity. Effects in humans, particularly if you have data emerging from clinical trials, then you fit that in. Kinetics in humans, safety and efficacy information. If it has been marketed elsewhere, then countries where the investigation product has been approved and marketed, you add information. And finally, end with a summary. Just a last couple of slides to tell you that studies can go wrong. This is a very favorite cartoon of mine. You know, you have these two rats and they are looking at the scientist over there and say, I ruined his work of a lifetime. Instead of rushing towards the food when he rang the bell, I ran in the opposite direction deliberately. So this is the famous T. Gennaro tragedy, where normal healthy volunteers who were given the super agonist actually developed cytokine storm and they had gangrene of the fingers. So understanding the IV is very important, but remember that studies can still go wrong. And this is one study which we did for Wockhardt with an intravenous fluoroquinolone phase 1 study. The baseline ECG was normal, and once we injected the fluoroquinolone and took the ECG an hour later, we found that the patient had ectopic beats. Is it because of the drug? Did he have ectopic beats anyway? Did we miss something on an earlier ECG? So what's important again is in GCP, protect the rights, safety, and well-being of subjects, ensure data integrity, but never ever say this is not my job. Everything is everyone's job, because if you don't have a team, there is no GCP. For some of the students listening in, you might want to read this book called as 26 Marathons, and a sincere acknowledgement to the team with which I worked for the Covishield study. But nothing in life can be achieved without teamwork. Yeah. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and I thank you for your kind attention.
So thank you so much, ma'am.
Finished on time. Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am. Absolutely on time. Thank you so much, ma'am, for elaborating on the various elements of these essential documents, and especially giving an overview of this essential document and emphasizing how much these documents are important as far as maintaining the safety and well-being of the patient, and more importantly, to ensure the quality of the data as well. So the session is open. If anyone is having question, they can ask. Ma'am, there is a question. Yeah. Dr. Shubham Attal, I think Dr. Shubham is from AIMS Bhopal. Dr. Shubham is asking, would it be mandatory to have an IB as a part of submission to the EC? And secondly, in case of approved drugs, would the information leaflet or package insert serve as IB?
So the answer to the second part of the question, that is, in case of approved drugs, in the package insert definitely is adequate information. The IB is generally, the investigative brochure is something that is given by the pharmaceutical company for regulatory trials. It would be very difficult for an investigator to put together an investigative brochure. So for that purpose, then the package inserts or the package leaflets would suffice as the IB, because the drug is marketed. And I'm assuming that academic studies or investigator-initiated studies, they will be working with a drug which is already marketed. Yeah. So for those of you who want these slides, I'm happy to share them as a PDF with the organizers. I'll send them to Dr. Dakle. Yeah, and yeah, because I went through the second part a little quickly, but it's all there in public domain. There is nothing that I've said which is not available in public domain. I've just put it together.
Ma'am, there is one more question from Dr. Pravi. Whenever there is a loss to follow-up, how to go ahead with the safety of subject which is missed in the protocol?
I don't understand what is missed in the protocol, but what's important is you must factor in loss to follow-up. I don't think you can have a single study where you don't have loss to follow-up. So you will have maybe a 5% dropout rate, 10%, 20%. What is most important to ascertain, to the extent possible, even after the patient is lost to follow-up, try and call up the patient. We do make telephonic calls to patients and try and ascertain the reasons for the loss to follow-up. Did the patient not come back because it was a side effect? Right? Did the patient not come back because the distance coming to KM hospital was long? Did they not come back for some family reasons? So these are important to ascertain the causes of the loss to follow-up, right? That's very critical in closing the loops with respect to both safety and efficacy. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, you absolutely are not able to do anything for the patients. So ascertain the reason for the loss to follow-up. It will happen. The least loss to follow-ups happen in community-based studies, right? You have a firm grip on the community. Most clinical trials, you will have some loss to follow-ups.
Ma'am, we will take last question. For title of a clinical trial, do we need to specify the duration of a specific phase trial, like a 6-month randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 2 trial for safety and efficacy for bronchial asthma? So do we have to mention the duration?
Not really. I think the question is coming from the PICO, no? Population, intervention, control, outcome. And sometimes there is a T in that PICO, that is the time frame.
Time frame.
I've seen titles which have the time frame. I've also seen titles which don't have the time frame. So I don't think it is paramount. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining. Over to organizer for the next session.
Thank you, Gopte Madam and Dr. Nitin sir, for completing the protocol this in a specific time period. Now I request Dr. Amol Patel sir to introduce the today's second speaker, Dr. Usharani Pingre Madam. Over to Amol sir.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Amol sir, please unmute.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Okay. Thank you, Nitya ma'am. It was a very lucid presentation, and I feel very happy whenever I hear to your presentations, ma'am. Every time I learn something new out of that.
Very kind. Thank you so much, Amol. Thank you.
Coming to the next speaker, Dr. Usha Rani ma'am. She's presently working as Professor and Head, Department of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics in Nizam Institute of Medical Sciences, Hyderabad. Ma'am is Member Secretary of NIMS EC for Stem Cell Research and Therapy. Ma'am is a certified NAB accessor for Ethics Committee. Ma'am is also a member of DBT Task Force for Translational Research on Development of Product and Processes, from Medicinal Aromatic Plant Coordinator and PI for ICMR Product Development Center NIMS. Ma'am is Coordinator for PVPI Regional Resource Center for Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Ma'am was a member of Harvard MRCT Post-Trial Access and Return of Individual Results Working Group. Ma'am has received various scientific awards and published more than 125 papers. I would like to add a few more points about ma'am. I'm not a direct student of ma'am, but I have learned through her papers. If you want to look into pain pharmacology, ma'am is the name. In the Google, you just type Dr. Usha Rani NIMS Hyderabad and pain pharmacology, whether it is a preclinical, clinical, you can get A to Z information about that. So with this brief introduction, I would request Dr. Usha Rani ma'am to take the charge now of presentation.
Thank you, Amol, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really humbled by what all you said. I don't think it's really so good about it. Anyway, and thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I think if you stop sharing, maybe I can share my screen.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so is it visible?
It's visible.
Yeah. And I'm audible too, I think.
Yeah, you are quite audible.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll be discussing for the next 20-25 minutes on the informed consent process. And it was very convenient for me. It's convenient because Nitya has actually given a good kickstart to my presentation, which will go in similar lines as GCP and consent, the importance of consent, elements of the consent form, documentation of the consent process, informed consent, a little about that in the vulnerable population, and a little about the AV recording and the guidelines. And I'll just, I'll spend a couple of minutes on the consent, especially during pandemics, which includes the e-consent. So I won't go into the details of, what is this informed consent and what is GCP, because it's being discussed by most of my earlier speakers. But what I'm interested was, in GCP, we concentrate more on the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of the subjects are protected. And this is one of the most important requirements of GCP. And going ahead, actually, we have the Indian GCP also. Now, the Indian GCP actually was finalized in 1996, became effective as early as 1997. But even the Indian GCP takes most of the extracts from the ICH GCP. And informed consent as by the Indian GCP, it is states it's a voluntary written assent of a subject's willingness to participate in a particular study and the documentation. So it is the consent process as well as the documentation of the process. And the confirmation is sought only after information of the trial is given, which includes everything right from the objectives, risks, benefits, and so on, which we'll be discussing shortly. And in the Indian GCP, there is a reference to who an impartial witness is. So many a times we do have a doubt as to who can be an impartial witness. And GCP very clearly states who can be an impartial witness. It says that, it is who will not be influenced in any way by those who are involved in the trial. So this is something which is extremely important. And then who will assist the process of consenting, which means if an impartial witness signs the document, it doesn't mean that it is simple signature of, signing a document. It means that everything which is in this document is what was told to the subject, and he has understood everything, and he has voluntarily given his consent. So that is the meaning of the signature of an impartial witness. So what is an informed consent? Coming to the main aspect, it is a process. So that's why I've made it in red. It is a process. It's a dynamic process which involves providing all relevant information to the subject and see that the subject has understood whatever is being given and then voluntarily agrees to participate. So these things, three things are extremely important. Information is being given, understanding, voluntary participation, but at the same time, the basic rights of the subject cannot be tampered. And all this has come because of the infamous experiments of the Tuskegee syphilis trial, then the Nazi war experiments, the human radiation experiments, and all these were discussed very elaborately by the first speaker, Dr. Melvin. So because of these infamous human research experiments, experiments conducted in the name of research on subjects without taking the consent, because of this, we have a series of codes of conduct which have come up right from the Nuremberg Code through the Helsinki's Declaration, the Belmont Report, ICH-GCP, and the Indian ICMR guidelines. So as early as 1980, we do have the policy statement, and then it has undergone a lot of revisions till the latest one in 2020, which I'll be discussing shortly. So informed consent, most of the time we think it is the sponsor's responsibility or it is the investigator or ethics committee. We are always in a dilemma. Who is responsible for the informed consent and the process? It is the responsibility of everybody. So if it is a sponsored trial, the sponsor is the one who actually forms the consent, and the sponsor discusses with the investigator, and the investigator needs to review the consent before submitting to the ethics committee, because there may be some of the regional issues or language issues or whatever, and then the investigator can ask the sponsor to modify before submitting to the ethics committee. And then it is the investigator who submits to the ethics committee the documents of informed consent which need to be approved. And then the investigator actually has to use only the latest version of the approved documents. So the elements which need to be very clearly emphasized in the consent form were described by Beauchamp and Childress as early as 1994. They have talked about these various elements, which talks about disclosure, which I've just mentioned, that what is the information being disclosed, how much information is being disclosed. Are you dumping the patient with too much of information so that he's not able to understand like a 20-30 pages of document, or it cannot be a one-page document where nothing is being disclosed. So you need to tell him all the aspects of the study which are going to help him in deciding whether he wants to participate or not. Then understanding. It is not enough if the investigator discloses everything. Has the patient understood whatever is being discussed? So it is, it's a good idea to have a checklist of everything, from the informed consent form, and you can just put a tick, 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 and ask the patient some questions so that you know that he has actually understood everything. After understanding, he needs to voluntarily give his consent. And then, is he competent enough to give the consent? So if you have the vulnerable groups, then again, the process is slightly different, though not grossly different. And then the consent, finally, the signatures. So good consent form needs to be complete with all the required information, with accurate information, and then comply with the regulations and guidelines. Now, if you're doing it for a clinical research project for the Indian company or in India, then you need to follow the CDSCO's guidelines the new clinical trial rules, the ICMR guidelines, and so on. But if we are doing the study for a multinational company, which is a multinational multicentric clinical trial for a US FDA submission, then you need to follow the US FDA requirements as well as the Indian guidelines. So you need to follow both. So this is again little important. The sentences need to be short and small and in simple terms. Now we have seen consent forms where a sentence runs into 6 lines. So that is a very long sentence, because by the time you come to the end of the sentence, you tend to forget what you had started. So please keep the sentences pretty small so that the subject understands whatever is being told in that paragraph, and in simple, understandable language and culturally sensitive language. So understandable means instead of saying hypertension, you can say high blood pressure, so something like that which a subject understands. So the elements, these are some of the important elements which need to be present in the informed consent. The statement mentioning it is research. Normally the consent form starts with, you are being invited to participate in this research project, because you're doing a research. Even if the drug is available or not available, it is a research which you're doing. The purpose of the research, just because you need to publish a paper or just because something is required in that context, it is not advisable to do research. There should be a purpose of doing the research. And then the methods have to be discussed in detail. Everything right from the number of samples being drawn. And sometimes we've seen in one consent, they had very conveniently skipped, if they were doing HBsAg or HIV testing, that was skipped actually, because they thought if they say HIV, the subject may not participate. So I think that is not a good idea. The duration and the frequency of the visits or whatever is being done, the investigation, what are the benefits to the participant community and others? So many times we have this question, if you're doing a bioequivalence study, then what is the benefit to the participant? Or a phase 1 study, there is actually no direct benefit to the participant. However, the data which is generated from subject's participation is going to help in the development of the particular molecule, or is going to help in the development of the science. So that is the benefit to the community, though not directly benefiting the participant. What are the unforeseeable risks, the discomforts? Then confidentiality of the records, because you're not supposed to disclose these documents to anybody unless it is required as per the policy of the institute or the regulatory, if there's an inspection or an audit. But otherwise the documents should not be disclosed to anybody. Payments and reimbursements, these are this should be very clearly specified. You should not pay phenomenally as to act as an undue inducement. That again, you need to justify also why the payment is being made. So there should be some sort of formula for you to calculate to say why you're paying this much. And then you cannot reimburse, either you have to have a ticket to reimburse, or state that you'll be paying some 300 or 500 for travel and for the participation or for the food or something. But if you're paying unduly, then it acts as an inducement, and that has to be justified and mentioned in the consent form. Treatment or compensation, then freedom to withdraw, just as Nitya very clearly said, if they want to withdraw, they should have a right, and they're free to withdraw from participation. But however, it's a good idea for the investigator to find out why, because it can be because of an ADR or for some logistic issues. So they should, but they cannot be forced to continue in the study. If they want to withdraw, they should have the freedom to withdraw, and that should not be affecting the future treatment or clinical consultation with the particular clinician. And then the contact persons, who is in the research team, the contact ethics committee member, and so on. And then you have the additional elements which may be optionally placed. And like I said, a checklist, it is always good to have a checklist even while making a consent, so that you don't miss on any of these aspects. So that you can, is the first thing it says, the language used is non-technical and understandable. If it is ticked, then it is fine. But if you feel it is not so, then you need to change it, so on. So always it's a good idea so that you don't miss on any aspect. And this is one thing, when I was member secretary, this was one thing which we was always concerned: translations and back translations. So what happens is when you give something for translation and you get it in a regional or a local language, you do get a translation certificate, and when you back translate, it comes back to the same thing. However, when you read it in detail, you have the name, signature, and date, and below the name it says write your name in capital letters. The same thing in the Hindi version says Naam, Hastakshar, and Dinank, which is name, signature, date. But when you read the line below that, write your name in capital letters becomes Rajdhani mein apna naam likho. Because capital, the Google understands as Rajdhani. Yes, we do understand capital is Rajdhani, but this is not what is actually intended to in this informed consent. And then when you back translate, Rajdhani becomes a capital. So, these are the subtle things which need to be reviewed by the investigator as well as the ethics committee members. So don't go blankly by the translation form. And then consent document and discussion, because you have the informed consent form and then the discussion and then the documentation of the whole process of consenting. Because even the FDA, if you see the information sheet, a guide to consent in as early as 1998, have very clearly said it is a process of information exchange. So it is always a dynamic process continuing throughout the study. And that is what I have depicted in this. It starts from the recruitment. You have given the consent form, taken the initial consent. And if there is any new information, change in any research procedure or visits, or if you think the subject is not in a position to correctly answer or do what is required as per the study, change in the drugstore status or an extension, you do have to modify the consent and then again submit to the ethics committee, take another approval, and then resubmit the version, take a reconsent of the subject from the ongoing study. And if there is an extension of the study, again you need to take a consent again for participation in the extension part, because some people may not be interested. Halfway down the study, you realize that you want to extend it by 1 year or 2 years. Then this is an extension part, and again you need to take a consent. So it is a continuous ongoing interaction. It is not a one-point signature like you sign a bank check. So revising the consent, the results of interim analysis demonstrate some or all patients are at a greater risk. If they continue to participate in the study, then you have to revise because interim analysis has given you some information on the safety, some information on the efficacy. So if you think the drug is very, very good, then again, you need to tell that. At the same time, the interim analysis says that there are some risks or some ADRs or, something which is not going to be, is going to be detrimental if the patient participates and there's a change in the consent, then that again has to be, submitted to the ethics committee. If there is a change in the investigator also, this is again, because you have, contact investigator, that part is there in the consent. So that also needs to be put as an amendment and then taken a reconsent. So reconsenting participants must be informed about any new information that may affect their willingness to participate in the trial. So when you take the process of consent, as I said, is continuous dynamic process, and then you need to have a proper environment. Like when you want to, conduct some program, a conference, you first look at the venue. How is the venue? Is the lighting good? Is it quiet? Or, something like that. So when you're, for the small things, when you're concerned, this is, concerning the right safety of the subject. So there should be a proper environment when you're going to take the consent. Then you can delegate the responsibility of consent, but it is always advisable to have a clinician along with a healthcare personnel who is giving the consent, because there are some technical questions which have to be answered by the clinician himself. Then in India, we do have the family members concept. The subject will take the consent home and then discuss with the family, and they may have some questions. So everything needs to be answered and documented, and then you have the consent signature. And I don't think this is a good, it's not a good idea to, put undue pressure on the subject for giving consent, because this is not the right atmosphere to take a consent. So, and then documentation. GCP very clearly says if it is not documented, it did not happen. So, and the documentation should be done real time. This is one of the audit findings which we had when we were doing some audits. You cannot say yesterday the patient came at 5 o'clock in the evening or at 9 o'clock in the morning. It should have been done yesterday. The patient came on 9th, it should have been written as 9th March and then written whatever happened, any questions asked, any answers given. And then 10th, if he comes back again, he says the patient came on 10th, you put the date on the left side and then document what all happened. All this has to be done real time. Anything done in a retrospective manner, especially for a consent, is not acceptable and it becomes an audit finding. So not only document what happened, document what did not happen, because it is a consent process and then you're going to ask him questions. He'll be asking questions, you're going to answer. So document what all was questioned. If they did not have any questions, you should also mention that the patient did not or the subject did not have any specific questions in regards to the protocol. Because once you write that, then it is very clear that you have tried your best to find out, but still he did not have any specific questions. So what did not happen also needs to be documented. And the document of consent especially needs to be complete. There should be no blank spaces, no additions and no deletions, and the signatures to be obtained. So we have seen sometimes the investigators writing in with a pen or a pencil, some note in the consent form at the side. This is definitely not an acceptable procedure. You can document in the source document, but never in the original consent form, because that consent form has been approved by the ethics committee. Anything which is made or removed becomes an amendment. So for obtaining the signature, the FDA says the patient or the authorized representative shall sign and date the consent. The OHRP says that the patient or the legally authorized representative can sign, but Indian and ICH GCP say that the consent form should be signed and personally dated by the subject or legally authorized representative. And if there are any specific institutional policies, you need to follow the same. And then distribution of the document. Now, where will it be? A copy of the consent form shall be given to the patient or representative as per US FDA. OHRP says a copy should be given to the person signing the consent form, whereas the Indian guidelines say that the subject should receive a copy of the signed and dated informed consent form. So it is always advisable to have a sentence saying that the consent form was given to the subject. And then again, if you can always again add another thing that I have received consent and take a subject signature, which will be pretty helpful. And these are the vulnerable population. You have, the ICMR guidelines specifically talked about vulnerable population, the ICMR guideline 2017. And they have given certain principles for research among the vulnerable population. So, and then they have stressed on the importance of consent also in the vulnerable population. And I just like to give one small example about informed consent and in prisoners, because when we were doing a study, it was a multinational multicentric study as sometime in the late early 2003-4, if I remember. We had this question of a prisoners had come. So prisoners, due to lack of control of their circumstances, are considered vulnerable. And then do not enroll a prisoner unless you check with the IRB first, because this is again important. And there must be a prisoner representative on the IRB board. So because of this, you need to check with the IRB. And then if a person becomes a prisoner during the trial, notify the IRB. And it also must, and you must be very clearly understood that the risk for the prisoner in the study is same as that of a non-prisoner. Just because he's a prisoner, don't think it's at higher risk. It is not so. And I was a little interested in this aspect. If a person becomes prisoner during the trial, what happens? So we did have some issues. One subject had become, there were some issues with the wife, and he was actually put behind the bars, and we didn't know about it till he had to come for the next visit. And again, we had to follow a lot of documentation process informing the IRB. So that was it. And consenting in minors is again something which is important, because it doesn't mean that if the child doesn't answer anything, it doesn't mean that the child has consented. So mere failure To object doesn't mean the child is consenting. And this is a little flow chart. If it is 18 and above, it is fair enough. You take the consent of the adult. And but if it is a child which is 7 to 12 years, verbal consent is required, and 13 to 17 years, a written assent is required. And in both the cases, the parent or the guardian needs to sign the consent. And a word about the AV recording. And if I'm just shooting my time, just do let me know. The word about AV recording. So you need to take consent prior to AV recording. This is again important because we have seen in an audit that there was no consent taken for AV recording. Because normally we are used to your, signing a document. But if you are doing a video audio recording, please take a consent. And then you should have specific SOPs to do the recording and the consenting, which was absent in many of the audit findings, which we couldn't find. And for AV recording, the camera should be of good resolution, because when we wanted to see what was recorded, it was very difficult finding out, who the investigator was, or we could just only make out from the voice what was being discussed. So there should be a good resolution camera, and there should be a soundproof room, so that you can very clearly listen what is being done, because all this is important. It increases the transparency, and then it saves the investigators from litigation. But however, it is time consuming. So it's selfies are fancy nowadays, and that's not a very good idea of taking AV recording, with the selfies and small cameras, because there'll be very little clarity, and in audits we do have problems. And storage of these these AV recordings is again, you should have an SOP for that. And then, because it should be stored at least for 5 years after completion of this study, and at least for 15 years sometimes, as per the requirement of the sponsor, if it's a phase 1 study. So it should be, the recording and storage should be done in the requirements as per the regulatory requirements, and you should have a proper SOP for it. So with my experience, some of the common findings of consent which we have noticed: the copy of the consent form was not given to the subject. Investigator dates for the subject, but you can make out very clearly with the handwriting who has dated for what. Investigator signs but forgets to date. Such things do happen, but have a note to file as to what happened and why it did not happen. ICF not administered in the language best understood by the subject. So this is again another thing. If the language not understood is, suppose you're having a English ICF, or if you're having a Hindi ICF or a Telugu ICF, and the subject signs in English, then if there is no note to file supporting this, then it becomes an audit finding. So, if there's any disparity, there should always be a note to file saying why it happened. An incorrect version of ICF, yes, that was being used phenomenally. And we did have, I think, out of around 50% of the studies, incorrect version was used, because the reconsent was not taken on the newer version. Some of the challenges, especially during pandemic, guidance documents reiterated consent is more than signature. It is a process, and it starts right from the beginning. And the whole purpose was to protect the right, safety, well-being of the subjects. However, during pandemics, there were a lot of redefining, modifying, and streamlining of practices which happened. And the most obvious change was the reconsent or a remote consent. So there is an increased demand for the researchers to get trained to access e-platforms, because most of the investigators are not used to accessing e-platforms, So this is again a challenge, because with the limited infrastructure present in the institutes, especially the government and the B-tier or C-tier cities, where you have very good investigators doing very good clinical research, but with limited access to the infrastructure. So that was a big hurdle. And then limited personnel, because due to COVID, or due to any pandemic, as it is, you have limited infrastructure and you have limited personnel supporting. So that again acts as a challenge, and limited access to technology, and lack of user-friendly, consent forms. Because the consent form, if it is running into 6 or 7 pages, it is very difficult viewing it, in your small mobile phone or something like that. Because as it is, the people are not very computer savvy, and then this is adding fuel to fire, so that's difficult. So ICMR had come up with a guideline April 2020 for conducting clinical trials during pandemic, and chapter 4 discusses the informed consent, where they very clearly described, especially during pandemic, there is a low decisional capacity of the patients who are critically ill, and there is very little difference between the relief offered and the research component, which means that especially during illnesses like COVID, where very little is known regarding the treatment, especially the earlier, the first and the second wave, where we didn't know many things about it. So there's a very gray area on, whether it's a research component or whether it is a treatment, because the most of the drugs were being repurposed. So subjects are vulnerable when such a situation arises. And electronic consent also is discussed in 4.2, which says it's an alternative procedure to avoid direct interaction with the subjects. And an EC approval is required because you're not documenting it with a signature, it's electronic based, and it may be remotely done, and there may or may not be a AV recording. So EC approval is required, and an EC can, in such situation, give a waiver of consent. So these are all the situations where an EC can give waiver of consent as per the ICMR guideline, where they very clearly say that research during humanitarian emergencies and disasters, where the participant may or may not be in a position to give a consent, you can ask for a waiver of consent. But you have challenges as well as benefits with e-consenting. The advantages are it's potentially advantageous because of the quality, efficiency, the flexibility, ability to monitor and track the subject's review process, because it's a real-time data entry happens, when you do anything online, you can have a very good audit trail of what happened during the entire procedure. However, having said that, I just want to reiterate on the challenges. Development of the consent, platform is again resource intensive, because we do have a lot of challenges in developing these electronic platforms. And then confirming the subject identity, date, and location. Now, this is challenge every time you do anything online. You don't know whether the subject, who is around the subject, whether he's being forced to accept something and give his consent. You're not at all sure what is happening. Amendment to the consents again become a problem. Reconsenting, as it is taking first consent, is difficult. Now we have to redo the whole process. It becomes even more little difficult. May require new areas of understanding and competency. And then the non-standard approaches may complicate regulatory and ethics review process, because even the ethics committee members, if they want to, actually follow the consent process, again becomes difficult. However, the bottom line ultimately is the investigator's responsibility to see that the rights, safety, and well-being of the subjects are being protected, and a well-informed consent is an integral part of subject protection. So a properly administered consent is the foundational concept of a GCP compliant trial. And if you want to apply these principles to our study, understanding is key to protecting the safety and integrity of the data, because if the subject understand what is happening, he can give a voluntary consent and the data will be more credible. And then it is ultimately the PI's responsibility. As I said, it is okay if you want to delegate responsibility, but abdication of responsibility is not acceptable. And fully informed consent can be needlessly cruel. So you can see the patient on the bed and the doctor trying to, describe the consent process, so it's not okay. If you're in giving the entire information, you should be in a position to understand whether the patient knows what is being discussed with him. And I'm not too sure if we have time for exercise. I've just crossed 44. So yeah, so this is just what I wanted to show you. If you can see, this is what, just a sample, because we had something like this in an audit where the writings looks similar. So we are not too sure whether it is the patient who has signed or the investigator who had signed and dated for the patient, because the ink and the writing seem similar. And then this is a case, these sort of things do come up, because an investigator, when you're interviewing subjects, he says that I trust you, doc, and whatever you say, whatever you think is good for me, you please do it. So, do you think it's ethical to enroll such a person in the trial? This is a little food for thought. You can think about it. And thank you for your patient listening. And I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a wonderful talk, ma'am. You told us about how to keep the size 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviation away from the normal and defining the normality. Talking about the content, talking about the preciseness, you very well explained, ma'am. And the age, what we tend to focus upon, it's not only that. There are many aspects we have to look into, what kind of information is being bombarded or provided to a participant. I would open the session for questions from audience.
Amol Sol, there are some questions in the chat box. You can go ahead with.
Okay, I'll read it out. First question is in assent, whether father or mother sign is must.
Yeah, I can see Nitya smiling there. This has definitely always been a challenge that, is the mother going to sign? Is the father going to sign? Both will sign. One of them will sign. So it says parent or the legally accepted guardian is going to sign. So, so either of the subjects, either of the parent is normally okay, but depends again on the study which is being done and, what all is required during that particular study. So anyone should be okay.
Okay, so in US, there is a wording called as a 1st degree blood relative, 2nd degree blood relative, 3rd degree blood relative, like that. So here, one of the parent can be okay. Second question is informed consent needed for the past record-based studies where patient data are marked with unique identifier?
Yeah, so this again, we do have come across this sort of queries in the ethics committee. So if you have if the patients are available and you can get them to sign the document, I think that is the best way to do it. But if that is not possible, and if it's some old pathology specimen or something which is being used, and if you're not able to get the patient to sign the consent and all, then you can ask for a waiver of consent from the ethics committee, provided you actually, have some unique identifier and the identity of the subject is not known. But having said that, I would again add that if it's some genetic study, and then the information which is comes out of such a study is going to be, useful for the patient or anything like that. So ideally, you should have a separate consent for genetic studies. So, it all depends again on the type of study which you're going to do and what will be the data which is going to come out of the study.
Exactly, agree, ma'am. The next question is unconscious patient with no relatives. Can we skip the consent for a life-saving procedure?
Yeah. So this again comes as a 2-tier consent. So if there is such a situation is there, so you obviously you will know which study you're doing, whether the study inclusion criteria involves such patient, and if it's required to do help for the benefit of the patient, you need to have an ethics committee approval definitely for this. And then if the patient is not able to do it, or if you don't have any relative around to give the consent, when the patient comes out or the relative is there, you need to again take the re-consent. So this is called a 2-tiered consent.
Exactly, ma'am. So if you are doing a MI trial or a stroke trial where patient is unconscious, you have nobody to trace around relative. So definitely a option of re-consent is there. Last one, ma'am.
Have an ethics committee approval.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
Documentation of the whole process is extremely important. That to real-time documentation.
Exactly, ma'am. So in which situation additional consent of spouse is required?
Additional consent of spouse. Okay. This we had come across this when in some studies which says that you should have follow contraceptive procedures. for, especially a phase 1 study for a prolonged period of time. So in fact, when this point did come up, because, in one study, this did not happen right as early as 1990s, when Nitya and myself, I think perhaps we were junior faculty or something like that, when we were earlier doing those clinical trials. So we did have an issue with the spouse coming and telling that she wasn't informed. Yeah, it is true. The consent is taken only from the person participating. So then from that time, we made it mandatory that if there is something like this and it needs to be done for a prolonged period of time, then it is always advisable to have consent. So it is all, like Nitya very rightly said, it is, you learn through the mistakes you make. And so today we are here because we did learn from the mistakes and from the guidance of, our mentors, Dr. M.U.R. Naidu sir and Dr. Neelima madam. So, perhaps, that really helps a lot to have a very good mentor helping you through these tough situations. Yeah.
Exactly, ma'am. So thank you for your guidance, ma'am. It was a wonderful session, and I thank everybody, organizing team, Nitya ma'am, Usha ma'am, Nitin sir, everybody. I would like Ganesh sir. I would like to thank everyone. On a lighter note, there was a Supreme Court verdict 6 months back saying that how can an informed consent form be of same nature for every surgical procedure, whether it is a cesarean section, whether it is a hernia, whether it is a cardiac surgery, how that can be same. So that stimulated again thought process in the EC committee about the content, what has to be put, alternatives, alternative arms that has to be known to a participant and all. Okay. So one thing, if it is documented, the thing has happened. If not documented, it did not happen. As simple as that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amol sir. Now we are towards the end of the session. I am very thankful to both the speakers for their excellent presentation, and as well as moderator Dr. Gaikwad sir and Dr. Patil sir. Lastly, my sincere thanks to all participants for their active participation. And with this, now I declare that today's session is over, and we will meet again on 17th March at 3 p.m. before Holi. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.